under the sky of New Orleans, where the humid winds from the Gulf of Mexico carry the salty breath of the sea. The festival night is as vivid as a painting created by lights and sounds. Lanterns sway along the narrow streets of the French Quarter, casting golden orange light onto the wet cobblestones after a brief rain. The sound of the saxophone harmonizes with the pounding drums from street bands, pulling crowds lost in bourbon whiskey and carefree dancing. That night, the space feels like an endless symphony where the boundaries between reality and dreams seem to dissolve. Jordan Bell, a 25-year-old with messy curly hair and deep eyes that seem to swallow every moment, weaves through the crowd. His old Nikon camera hangs loosely on his shoulder, lens aimed at street dancers, smiling vendors, and couples lost in the flickering lights of the festival. He is not just taking photos, he is telling stories. Each click of the shutter is a line of dialogue, each frame a piece of life. The atmosphere suddenly freezes, like a piece of music that someone accidentally dropped the conductor's baton to. Jordan's phone buzzes in his coat pocket, a faint sound, but enough to disrupt his train of thought. He pulls it out, the screen lighting up in the flickering darkness with a message from his mother, Lorraine Bell. "Jordan, where are you? Jamal's been arrested. Come home now." The message is short, no period, no explanation, but enough to make his heart tighten as if an invisible hand were squeezing it. His mind spins as images of Jamal, his 17-year-old cousin with a bright smile and sneakers always dirty with red dirt, flood in unexpectedly. Jamal, the kid who just last week sat on his couch telling stories about a math test he almost failed. How did he get arrested? The festival around him suddenly becomes a blurred painting, the sounds of laughter turning into distant echoes, and his feet automatically turn, pulling him away from the bright lights toward the downtown police station, where Jamal is being held. The road to the station isn't long, but each step Jordan takes feels heavier, as if each one weighs 1,000 pounds. He crosses darker streets, where the festival lights no longer reach, only the sound of distant sirens and the musty smell from old walls. His mind keeps asking, what did Jamal do? Is he all right? And why the police? He knows too well how black people like him and Jamal are perceived in this city. Sometimes, just a wrong glance, a hoodie slightly out of place, is enough to make you suspicious in the eyes of someone wearing a badge. But Jamal is not a troubled kid. He is a hardworking high school student who dreams of becoming a civil engineer to fix the bumpy roads in their poor neighborhood. So what happened? As Jordan pushes open the heavy glass door of the police station, the cold air from the air conditioning hits his face, mingling with the smell of burnt coffee and old sweat. Inside, the atmosphere is eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the vibrancy outside. A police officer stands behind the counter, glancing at him with indifference, as if he is just a shadow passing by the bulletproof glass. "I'm here to see Jamal Carter," Jordan says, his voice more firm than he expected, as if trying to suppress the anger rising within him. The officer raises an eyebrow, flipping through a few pages on his desk, then points down the hall. "Cell number 3. But don't expect a long visit. He's under investigation." Investigation? The word rings in Jordan's mind like an alarm bell. He quickly walks down the hall, his sneakers making harsh tapping sounds on the concrete floor, his heart pounding in his chest. At the end of the hall, through the cold metal bars, he sees Jamal. The boy is sitting curled up on a metal bench, hands holding his knees, his favorite green hoodie now covered in mud with a tear at the shoulder. His face, usually bright with a mischievous smile, is now bruised, one eye swollen, his lower lip bleeding. "Jamal!" Jordan calls, his voice breaking in the small, confined space. Jamal looks up, his red-rimmed eyes lighting up with a spark of hope when he recognizes his cousin. Jordan, I didn't do anything, he whispers, his voice trembling as if about to cry. I was just walking home after tutoring, and they pulled me into the car, said I robbed some jewelry store. Jamal pauses, takes a deep breath, as if recounting this story is like stabbing another wound into his own pride. Jordan grips the metal bars, his fingers turning white from the force. Who did this to you? He asks, though deep down, he already has a vague guess of the answer. Jamal shakes his head, eyes lowering. A cop. He told me not to pretend I'm innocent, that he knows how we are. Each of Jamal's words is like a knife stabbing Jordan's heart, but he doesn't let his emotions take over. He needs the truth. He needs to understand what happened before it spirals out of control. Stay calm, he says, his voice softening to reassure him. I'll find a way to get you out of here. But as he turns to leave the holding room, Jordan knows that this promise is not simple. The festival night, with all its dazzling beauty, has shattered in his eyes, leaving a cold reality. Jamal, an innocent boy, is being held just because of his skin color. And Jordan, with his camera still hanging on his shoulder, knows that he cannot stand by and watch everything slip away like this. This is the beginning of a battle he never imagined he would face. The door to the police station clicks shut behind Jordan Bell with a dry snap, as if it were closing off the vibrant festival world he had just left behind. Inside, the atmosphere was stifling, with the cold white glow from fluorescent lights hanging from the ceiling, casting pale, sterile patches of light on the concrete floor. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the dampness of peeling, stained walls made him wrinkle his nose. But his mind had no room for such trivial details. The image of Jamal, his 17-year-old cousin with a bruised face, eyes red with fear and injustice, had burned itself into his mind like an unhealing scar. He walked up to the counter, where a middle-aged officer, with a clean-shaven face and indifferent eyes, was flipping through the pages of a thick ledger. I need to speak with the officer who arrested Jamal Carter, Jordan said, his voice as sharp as a knife, though inside him, a storm of emotions was churning. The officer looked up, briefly glanced at him through thick-rimmed glasses, then cracked a faint smile that seemed to be more of a sneer than a greeting. If you want to see anyone, you'll have to wait, he replied in a monotone voice, as though reciting from script. But I recommend you don't make this any more difficult. The kid's being investigated for robbing a jewelry store on Decatur Street. The evidence is clear. Jordan clenched his fists inside his coat pockets, his nails digging into his palms as he fought to stop himself from charging over the counter and shouting at the officer. What evidence? He asked, his voice lowering to a growl. The officer shrugged nonchalantly and motioned down the hall with his hand. Ask Walsh. He's in interrogation room, too. Without a moment's hesitation, Jordan turned and strode down the narrow hallway, his sneakers clacking on the concrete floor with each step, the pounding of his heart echoing in his ears. At the end of the hall, behind cold iron bars, he saw Jamal. The boy was hunched over on a metal bench, his hands wrapped tightly around his knees, the green hoodie he loved now caked with mud and torn at the shoulder. His face, usually bright with his mischievous grin, was now marked with bruises, one eye swollen shut, his lower lip bleeding. Jamal, Jordan called, his voice cracking in the confined space. Jamal looked up, his red-rimmed eyes lighting up with a glimmer of hope as he recognized his cousin. Jordan, I didn't do anything, he whispered, his voice trembling as if he were about to cry. I was just walking home from my extra class, and they pulled me into the car and said I robbed a jewelry store. Jamal paused, taking a deep breath, as if reliving the event was another blow to his already shattered dignity. Jordan gripped the cold bars with white knuckles. Who did this to you? He asked, though deep inside, he already suspected the answer. Jamal shook his head, his eyes dropping. A cop. He told me not to pretend I'm innocent, that he knows how we are. Each word from Jamal felt like a dagger in Jordan's heart, but he didn't let his emotions take over. He needed the truth. He needed to understand what happened before it spiraled completely out of control. Stay calm, he said, his voice steady and reassuring. I'll find a way to get you out of here. But as he turned to leave the holding room, Jordan knew that this promise was not simple. The festival night, with all its vibrant beauty, had shattered in his eyes, leaving only a cold, harsh reality. Jamal, an innocent boy, was locked behind bars just because of his skin color. And Jordan, with his camera still hanging on his shoulder, knew he couldn't stand by and let this injustice go unchallenged. This was the beginning of a fight he never thought he would have to face. As Jordan Bell stepped out of the police station, the air of New Orleans hit him like a crashing wave, carrying the sweet scent of rum from nearby bars and the distant sounds of laughter from crowds still reveling in the festival. But all of it was just a thin veneer, a glamorous curtain hiding the coldness he had just endured inside those gray concrete walls. The night had grown deeper. The sky was blackened and obscured by thick clouds, with no stars to soothe his troubled mind. The camera hanging from his shoulder now felt heavier, as if carrying the weight of everything he had just witnessed. Jamal, his 17-year-old cousin with bright eyes now red from fear, locked behind bars, accused of a vague charge by Derek Walsh. The words of that officer still echoed in his head, sharp and smooth like a blade honed by prejudice. I don't need cameras to know what kids like him are doing around here. Jordan took a deep breath, his exhale blending with the humid air, but the anger inside him remained, smoldering like a fire waiting for the right moment to flare up. He walked along the street leading home, his sneakers quietly gliding over the wet sidewalk, streetlights casting reflections of his face in small puddles, a face both weary and resolute. He couldn't erase the image of Jamal huddled on the cold metal bench, nor could he forget how Walsh had looked at him, as though he were merely an annoying obstacle daring to question the authority he had granted himself. But what truly unsettled Jordan wasn't Walsh's attitude, but the sense of helplessness that was slowly rising within him. He knew the system all too well, not from books or movies, but from the stories within his own family. His mother, Lorraine, had told him about the times his father was stopped by the police just for looking suspicious, even though he was a construction worker with rough hands and a kind heart. Jordan grew up hearing these warnings, but he never imagined they would touch Jamal, the boy he considered his little brother, always carrying a notebook filled with drawings of bridges and buildings he dreamed of building one day. As he turned down the alley leading to the low-rise neighborhood where his family lived, the light from an old television in a first-floor apartment caught his attention. Through the cracked window, the voice of a local news anchor rang out, sharp and unyielding. Sheriff Marvin Hayes made a statement tonight about the city's security. A jewelry store robbery on Decatur Street was swiftly dealt with thanks to the timely intervention of the police. The suspect, a juvenile, has been arrested. Jordan froze, his eyes widening as the screen shifted to show Marvin Hayes, a tall man with neatly combed salt and pepper hair and cold, piercing eyes under the flash of the camera's lights. Hayes stood behind a podium, his voice booming like a well-rehearsed speech. This is a prime example of the young criminals who are destroying our city. We will not tolerate this. I promise that New Orleans will be a safe place for tourists and residents, thanks to the dedication of our police force. Hayes's words fell like cold raindrops, seeping into every corner of Jordan's soul. He didn't mention Jamal by name, but Jordan knew exactly who the juvenile was. The image of his bruised cousin in the holding cell flashed in his mind, running parallel to Hayes's bold proclamation, creating a bitter contrast. This wasn't justice. It was a play, a stage performance meant to appease the tourists and the press, to keep the dollars from the festival flowing into the city's coffers. Jordan felt his stomach twist, not from hunger, but from the bitter truth slowly unfolding. Jamal was not just a victim of Walsh, but of a massive system, one where people like him were turned into sacrificial lambs for what was called order. He pushed open the door to his home, the small apartment he shared with his mother, now eerily silent, broken only by the ticking of a wall clock. Lorraine sat in her old armchair, her hands clasped tightly together, her face etched with deeper lines than usual. She looked up when she heard the door, her red eyes flashing with unspoken worry. "Where have you been, Jordan?" she asked, her voice hoarse, as though she had been crying. "I went to the station," he replied, his voice lowering as he sat across from her. "Jamal's been arrested for robbery, but he didn't do anything. An officer named Walsh said he was suspicious just because he was near the scene." Lorraine shook her head, her hands trembling as they rested on her forehead. "Again," she whispered, as if speaking to herself. "They always do this. They look at us and see nothing but criminals." Jordan leaned forward, his hands pressing into his knees. "I won't let them do this to Jamal, Mom. I'll find a way to get him out." But even as he spoke those words, he could feel the weight of the system pressing down on him. He wasn't a lawyer, didn't have the money to hire a defense attorney, and what he had, his camera and his watchful eyes, seemed too small against this massive machine. Lorraine looked at him, her gaze pained but resolute. "You have to be careful, Jordan. They don't like it when we resist. They'll find a way to break you before you even get close to them." His mother's warning was like a sharp cut, but it didn't make him falter. On the contrary, it fueled the fire inside him. He stood up, walked over to the small table where his phone lay still, and sent a message to Elena Morales, his girlfriend, an investigative journalist with a sharp pen and a heart unafraid to confront injustice. "Elena, I need you. Jamal's been wrongly arrested. Meet me at the house right now." He sent the message, the screen lighting up for a second before dimming. But Jordan knew that it was the first glimmer of light cutting through the darkness. He couldn't fight the system alone, but he wouldn't let it swallow Jamal without a fight. Hayes and Walsh might think they had everything under control under their stage lights, but Jordan would prove that their darkness could not hide the truth forever. The faint light from an old desk lamp in Jordan Bell's small apartment illuminated the cracked walls, where small fissures, like tiny veins, told the story of a house that had witnessed too many New Orleans rainstorms. The night had passed its halfway point, but the space in the cramped living room offered no peace. The steady ticking of the wall clock was drowned out by Jordan's quick breaths as he hunched over the chipped wooden table, his sharp eyes scanning each frame on the Nikon camera's screen. The camera, his loyal companion through colorful streets and everyday moments, was now not just a tool for capturing beauty, but his only weapon to pull Jamal from the darkness of the bars. Beside him, Elena Morales stood leaning against the doorframe, her arms crossed over her chest, her long black hair gently swaying over her shoulder whenever she tilted her head in observation. Her brown eyes, sharp and uncompromising, glinted with curiosity mixed with determination, the mark of a journalist who is used to facing buried secrets. "Are you sure there's something here?" Elena asked, her voice gentle but tinged with doubt. Jordan didn't look up, his finger gliding over the camera's controls, zooming in on each detail of the photo he took right before receiving the text from his mother. "Definitely," he answered, his voice deep and steady, as if confidence was the only thing holding him together at that moment. "I took the shot near Decatur, right when the festival was at its peak. If Jamal didn't do anything, the real culprit must be somewhere in this crowd." Elena stepped closer, bending over the small screen, her breath lightly brushing his shoulder, carrying the faint scent of coffee and ink, the scent of someone who had lived among newspapers and untold stories. The photo that appeared on the screen was a beautifully chaotic scene. Dancers in sparkling costumes spinning under lantern lights, festival masks concealing the faces of the crowd, and in the distance, the corner of Decatur Street lit up with artificial lights from the shops. Jordan zoomed in on each corner, each face, every shadow swallowed by the light. His eyes, accustomed to capturing the smallest details in street photos, now worked with intense focus, like a hunter tracking a trace through the deep forest. Then he paused. A figure on the edge of the frame, near the jewelry store mentioned by Walsh, caught his attention. The person was wearing a gray jacket, the hood pulled low to obscure most of the face, and holding something shiny, perhaps a necklace or a wad of cash just snatched. Jordan frowned, his finger pausing on the control button. "Look at this," he said, his voice rising with restrained excitement. "This isn't Jamal. Jamal wears a green hoodie, not gray." Elena leaned closer, her eyes narrowing as she observed the blurry figure. "The photo quality isn't great," she commented, her voice tinged with caution. "But it doesn't look like Jamal. But how can we prove this person is connected to the robbery?" Jordan turned to look at her, his lips curving into a small, wan smile, not out of joy, but because he knew she was right. This photo wasn't enough to overturn Walsh's accusation. "Not yet," he said, standing up and reaching for the coat hanging on the chair. "But if this person was near the store at the right time, someone must have seen him. I need a witness." Outside, the night wind picked up, carrying the chill from the nearby Mississippi River. Jordan and Elena stepped out of the apartment, the streetlights casting their long shadows on the wet sidewalk. The French Quarter had quieted down, with only a few drunken tourists stumbling along the street and street vendors cleaning up their booths after the day's hustle. Jordan led Elena to the corner of Decatur Street, where he had taken the photo, each step carrying a clear purpose. He stopped in front of the jewelry store, a small shop with a window, now taped up, hiding the crack from the robbery. His eyes scanned the scene, looking for any sign that could connect with the photo in the camera. "Do you remember anything here?" Elena asked, interrupting his thoughts. Jordan nodded, pointing to a corner of the street a few meters away from the store. "An old man selling snacks. He was standing right here when I took the picture. If anyone saw the guy in the gray jacket, it's got to be him." They walked to the corner, where a small wooden cart was still there, though the vendor had left. But luck hadn't fully abandoned them. An older man, with dark skin and silver hair, was sitting on the steps nearby, holding a hand-rolled cigarette, his tired eyes gazing at the empty street. Jordan recognized him immediately. It was the elderly man who sold sandwiches that he had photographed a few weeks ago. "Hello, sir." Jordan spoke, his voice gentle but tinged with urgency. The old man looked up, his cloudy eyes flashing with a hint of curiosity. "Oh, you're the guy with the camera, right?" he asked, his voice raspy like the wind blowing through dry leaves. Jordan nodded, sitting down next to him to create a more friendly atmosphere. "I need your help. Tonight, near the jewelry store, did you see anyone wearing a gray jacket with a hood?" The old man furrowed his brow, took a long drag from his cigarette, the white smoke swirling in the air before dissipating. "Yeah," he replied slowly, as if dredging up the memory. "A white kid, didn't look like a local. He stood near the store, holding something shiny, then ran off when the crowd started yelling after the glass broke. I told the cops, but they didn't listen. They were more focused on the black kid who walked by afterward." The old man's words hit Jordan like a bolt of lightning. He glanced at Elena, who had already pulled out a small notebook and pen from her jacket pocket, scribbling down the details at a pace that showed she knew every second mattered. "The black kid he's talking about is my cousin," Jordan said, his voice lowering with a pain too deep to put into words. "The police arrested him without evidence, just because he was nearby." The old man sighed, his frail shoulders shaking slightly in the cold breeze. "I know," he whispered. "They always do this. But I'm telling you the truth. If you need me to, I'll say it in front of anyone you want." Jordan stood up, his hand tightly gripping the camera, as if to hold onto the glimmer of hope that had just sparked. The figure in the lens was no longer an unknown shadow. Now, thanks to the old man, it had an identity, a skin color, a story. Elena placed her hand on his shoulder, her eyes flashing with determination. "This is just the beginning, Jordan," she said. "But we need more than this to tear down Walsh's story." He nodded, his gaze turning back to the jewelry store now lost in the darkness. The trace in the lens had led him here, but he knew the road ahead would be long, and the darkness of the system wouldn't be easily dispelled by the light from this small camera. As dawn broke over the skies of New Orleans, the first rays of light pierced through the thick fog from the Mississippi River, casting a golden hue over the old tiled roofs and the streets still drowsy after the festival night. But for Jordan Bell, that light brought no hope. It only made the harsh reality he was facing more vivid. Jamal, his cousin, was still locked behind bars, his bruised face a constant reminder of the injustice they were fighting. Jordan stood in his small room, his sun-tanned hands trembling as he checked the mini camera, a compact device he bought from a secondhand electronics store a few months ago, originally used to capture nighttime street scenes when a light wasn't enough for his beloved Nikon. Now, it was no longer a toy for an amateur photographer. It was the knife he would use to cut through the curtain hiding the truth. Elena Morales had left in the early morning after the two had spent hours sitting at the chipped wooden table, analyzing each detail from the photo and the old vendor's testimony. His story, about a person wearing a gray jacket, white skin, holding something shiny, was the first spark through the darkness, but both Jordan and Elena knew it wasn't enough to overturn Derek Walsh's accusations. The police would dismiss the testimony of an old street vendor, calling it an unreliable statement from someone with no power in society. They needed hard evidence, something that no one, not even Marvin Hayes with his flowery speeches, could deny. And Jordan had made a decision. He would return to Decatur, not to take more photos, but to set a trap of images and sound, where Walsh would expose his true face. He slipped on his worn silver-gray jacket, tucking the mini camera into the inside pocket, where it nestled neatly between the thick fabric, the tiny lens poking out through a small hole he had intentionally made earlier. It was barely dawn, but the French Quarter still had the sluggish air of a long night. Beer cans scattered on the sidewalk, liquor store signs bent by the wind, and a few workers slowly sweeping under the weak sunlight. Jordan walked to the corner of Decatur, where the jewelry store now sat silently like a small grave in the heart of the city. The broken glass had been replaced with a makeshift plywood board, but the traces of the robbery remained, like a scar that hadn't yet healed. He stood still for a moment, his eyes scanning the surroundings, looking for the perfect spot to hide the camera. Finally, he chose an old streetlight a few steps from the store. Underneath the rusted metal shell, there was a small gap just wide enough to slip the device in, the lens aimed directly at the street where Walsh usually patrolled. Jordan bent down, pretending to tie his shoe, and deftly slid the camera into the gap, turning on the recording mode before standing up. He took a few steps back, checking the angle with the naked eye. It covered the whole street, from the jewelry store to the corner where the crowd often gathered. If Walsh showed up, if he did anything to reveal his bias or concealment, the camera would catch it. But Jordan didn't just want to record Walsh. He wanted to understand why the truth could be so easily twisted. He took out his phone, sending a brief text to Elena. Camera set. Waiting for Walsh. Can you come to Decatur? I need a second set of eyes. The message sent, and he leaned against a nearby wall, pretending to be distracted. But in reality, his eyes were tracking every movement on the street. Less than an hour later, Elena appeared, her faded denim jacket hugging her small frame, her eyes sparkling with the vigilance of a journalist always ready to dig up the truth. She said nothing, simply nodded at Jordan before sitting on a wooden bench a few meters away, pretending to read a newspaper she had picked up nearby. The two of them sat in silence, blending into the scene like accidental passersby, but their minds were sharp as blades, waiting for the prey to step into the trap. And then Walsh appeared. He drove the familiar black and white patrol car, the flashing lights on the roof dimming as he stopped near the jewelry store. Walsh got out, his tall figure clad in the dark blue uniform, his pale blue eyes scanning the street with the self-satisfaction of someone in power. Jordan clenched his fists in his jacket pocket, his breath slowing as Walsh began his patrol. He stopped in front of the store, eyeing the plywood covering the broken glass, then turned to a group of black teenagers standing a few meters away, laughing after a long night. Hey, what are you doing here? Walsh shouted, his voice sharp, his hand resting on his gun holster like a silent threat. A 15-year-old boy in the group shrugged and replied, I'm just standing here, I didn't do anything. Walsh moved closer, his black shoes pounding loudly on the sidewalk. Don't mess with me, he growled. You're standing near a place that just got robbed. I have the right to search you. He started rifling through the boy's jacket pockets, ignoring the panicked looks from the other kids around. Jordan glanced at Elena, seeing that she had lowered the newspaper, her hands discreetly jotting notes in her small notebook. But what made him freeze wasn't Walsh's actions with the kids. It was what happened next. A group of drunken white tourists staggered out of a nearby bar, yelling and knocking over a trash can onto the street. The sound of metal crashing was deafening, but Walsh only glanced over, curled his lips in a slight smile, and turned back to the black teenagers. They're just having fun, he muttered loud enough for Jordan to hear from his distance. You guys are different. He continued searching, ignoring the rowdy tourists without checking them. Jordan's heart raced as he realized this wasn't just bias. It was a pattern. Walsh didn't care about the truth. He chose his victims based on skin color, based on prejudice deeply ingrained in his bones. And then, a moment that nearly made him gasp, Walsh walked closer to the jewelry store, looking around as if inspecting something, then deliberately turned his back to the security camera mounted on the store's awning. A move so blatant, as if he knew it was there and didn't want to be recorded. Jordan gritted his teeth, his hand in his jacket pocket tightening to the point where his knuckles cracked. He knew that camera could prove Jamal's innocence, but Walsh didn't check it. Or worse, he was deliberately covering it up. When Walsh got back in his car and drove off, Elena stood up and walked over to Jordan, her eyes blazing. Did you see that? She whispered. He's not just biased. He deliberately avoided the camera. If it caught the guy in the gray jacket, Jamal wouldn't have been arrested. Jordan nodded, his eyes fixed on the streetlight where the camera was still recording. I've got him, he said, his voice deep like a vow. This camera will give us the truth he wants to hide. He walked over to the streetlight, took the device out, his hands trembling as he pressed the stop button. The truth, cold and undeniable, was now in his hands, but he knew it was just one piece of the puzzle. To tear down the darkness of Walsh and Hayes, he needed more, and he wouldn't stop until Jamal stepped out of that darkness. The midday heat in New Orleans carried the heavy warmth of the South, the moisture from the Mississippi River rising like an invisible curtain, wrapping around every street and making the air feel more stifling than ever. Jordan Bell sat in his small apartment, the sunlight piercing through the tattered curtains, casting shadows on his face, a face now marked by a mixture of tension and hope. On the old wooden table in front of him was the mini camera, the tiny screen still showing the final frames of the footage he recorded this morning. Derek Walsh, turning his back to the jewelry store security camera, his broad shoulders in the dark blue uniform seemingly trying to hide something from the light of justice. Beside him, Elena Morales typed on her laptop at the speed of a storm, her long fingers gliding over the keys like a pianist playing their most urgent piece. Her brown eyes were full of intense focus, not leaving the screen for even a second, as if every word she wrote was a bullet shot at the system that had imprisoned Jamal. "Are you sure this part is clear enough?" Elena asked, her voice cutting through the silence, sharp but tinged with concern. Jordan leaned forward, rewinding the footage on the camera, his eyes fixed on every movement of Walsh. "Clear as day," he replied, his voice deep but steady as rock. He's not just avoiding the camera, he knows it's there. And the way he disregards the drunk tourists to focus on the black kids, that's no coincidence. It's the most vivid evidence we have. Elena nodded. A faint smile flashed across her lips, but it quickly vanished as she turned back to the screen. "Good," she said, "because this article won't just be a story, it will be a bomb." In the next few hours, the small room became a silent battlefield. Jordan transferred the footage to Elena's laptop, each frame carefully edited by her to illustrate the growing article. He sat beside her, recounting in detail what he had witnessed through the lens, from Walsh's smug walk, the cold stare he gave while searching innocent teenagers, to the moment he intentionally turned his back on the security camera like an awkward actor trying to hide a mistake on stage. Elena listened, her invisible pen turning those accounts into sharp sentences, each line of text like a knife stabbing through the shield of the New Orleans police. The article's title gradually appeared on the screen: Wrongful Arrest, Prejudice or Cover-Up? Concise, fierce, and unforgiving, like a trumpet's blast in the middle of a sorrowful jazz piece. When the draft was completed, Elena sent it to the editor of the Crescent Times, a small local newspaper with a strong voice in the community. She didn't choose the bigger papers in Baton Rouge or out of state because she knew this story needed to resonate from the heart of New Orleans, where people like Jamal lived and endured every day. Jordan stood behind her, his hand resting on the back of her chair, his breath softly brushing against her long black hair as he read the article one last time. Officer Derek Walsh, who arrested a 17-year-old black teenager on suspicion of robbing a jewelry store on Decatur Street, ignored the security camera that could prove the boy's innocence. The article began, the tone cold but as sharp as a surgical scalpel. The video provided by an independent source shows Walsh not only disregarding the surveillance device, but also targeting innocent black individuals while overlooking the disruptive actions of white tourists. A clear pattern of bias in his behavior. Elena attached the video, the image of the gray-clad figure from Jordan's lens, and the old vendor's testimony, each piece fitting together to form an undeniable picture. Less than 2 hours later, the article was posted on the Crescent Times website. Like a stone thrown into a still pond, it created ripples spreading at lightning speed. Jordan and Elena sat in front of the laptop, watching every share on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, where New Orleans residents began speaking out. One person wrote, "Again, the police arrest an innocent person just because they're black." Another posted the video with a caption, "This is the real face of the order Hayes brags about." Hashtags like hashtag Justice for Jamal and hashtag New Orleans Truth began trending, spreading from the French Quarter across the city, then beyond state lines. The voice from a newspaper wasn't just Elena's. It was the echo of hundreds, thousands of people who had been overlooked or trampled by this system. But the storm didn't stop at social media. When the news reached local TV stations, an afternoon broadcast on WDSU aired footage of Marvin Hayes standing before a crowd of reporters, his face reddened under the flashbulbs. "We are investigating the matter," Hayes said, his voice stiff like he was reading from a pre-prepared script. "If there's an error, it's a personal mistake by an officer, not a policy of the police department. I am committed to clearing everything up." But his usual confidence had faltered, his eyes quickly scanning the crowd, as if looking for a way to escape the glaring light from the relentless questions. "What about the video?" "Chief Hayes," a reporter yelled. "Why wasn't the security camera checked from the beginning?" Hayes pursed his lips, said nothing, and hurried into the police building, leaving behind a noisy crowd and skeptical stares. Jordan turned off the TV. The room fell silent, with only the faint hum of the ceiling fan above. He looked at Elena, his eyes shining with a rare glimmer amidst these dark days. "You did it," he said, his voice rough from lack of sleep, but filled with emotion. Elena smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Not yet," she replied, standing up and grabbing her jacket. "Hayes won't let this slide. He'll try to cover it up and blame Walsh to keep his seat. We need to push harder." Jordan nodded, his hand subconsciously resting on the camera on the table, the companion that had led him here. The voice from a newspaper had spoken, awakening the entire city, but he knew that the shadow of the system wouldn't vanish just from one article. It needed a harder blow, and he and Elena would be the ones to deliver it at any cost. As the sun began to tilt toward the west, New Orleans awakened in an unusual hue, not the vibrant hustle and bustle of the festival, but the simmering tension, like a jazz tune shifting from a lively melody to heavy, bitter notes. Jordan Bell stood before the mirror in his small room, his deep eyes reflecting through the dusty, fogged glass. No longer just the gaze of a photographer, but that of an unwilling warrior. Elena Morales' article in the Crescent Times had set a fire to the dry wood of public opinion, and that fire was now spreading, uncontrollable by the clumsy justifications of Marvin Hayes. The video he recorded, the image of Derek Walsh turning his back to the security camera, his blatant bias in ignoring the white tourists to target the black teenagers, had gone viral across social media, becoming a silent scream from the streets that the system thought it had suffocated. Jordan pulled on a black hoodie, not to hide, but to blend in with the crowd gathering in front of the Eastern Police Station, where Jamal was still being held. He carried his Nikon camera, not to capture artful photographs, but to document this moment, the moment he knew would change everything. As he stepped out of his apartment, the air outside felt different. No longer the scent of rum or the sound of a saxophone, but the breath of rage, whispers gradually turning into screams. He walked toward the police station, each step echoing like the beat of a drum, driving a small but unstoppable revolution forward. On the street, he met Elena, standing among a group of people from the lower-income neighborhood, her arms tightly clutching a notebook, her eyes ablaze like the fire she had kindled through each word she wrote. "You're just in time," Elena said, her voice cutting through the noise of the crowd gathering. "They've seen the article, the video. They're furious." Jordan looked around. Dozens, then hundreds of people from the Black and Latinx communities were pouring in, from mothers with red eyes full of worry for their children, to young men with clenched fists, ready to face anyone who dared to stand in their way. An older man, dark-skinned with a worn baseball cap, approached Jordan, his hands trembling as he held up a rushed printed photo of Jamal, his smiling face in a family photo, not the bruised face Jordan had seen through the bars. "You're the cousin of that boy, right?" he asked, his hoarse voice filled with power. I don't know him, but I know this scene. My son was once wrongfully arrested like this. We have to do something." Jordan nodded, his lips tightly pressed, saying nothing except a silent promise in his eyes. He stepped onto a wooden crate someone had pulled out into the crowd, raising the photo of Jamal that the old man had given him. "Jamal Carter is my cousin," he shouted, his voice ringing through the street, drowning out the sound of cars and the cold wind from the river. "He's 17 years old, walking home after extra classes, and the police arrested him just because he's black." Derek Walsh didn't need evidence, didn't need a camera. He just needed someone to blame. But we know the truth. The crowd erupted, chants ringing out like waves. "Free Jamal! Free Jamal!" Jordan jumped down, handing the photo to a young woman in the group, then leading the crowd toward the police station, where the flashing red and blue lights on the patrol cars began to flicker, signaling panic. In front of the station, a line of officers stood blocking the entrance, wielding batons and riot shields, their faces tense under the evening sun. But Jordan didn't stop. He walked forward, his hands raised high. No weapons, just the camera slung over his shoulder like a flag of victory. "We're not rioting," he yelled, his voice piercing through the metal barricade of police. "We want justice. Jamal is innocent, and you know it." The crowd behind him repeated his words, holding up homemade signs that read, "The lights don't see us." The slogan Elena had written in the article, now becoming the rallying cry of an entire community long forgotten. The pressure from the streets wasn't just a shout, it was an invisible force pressing against the walls of the police station like it was going to crack them open. Inside, Marvin Hayes stood behind the large glass window, looking down, his face no longer the confident one, a leader, but the bewildered face of a man cornered. His TV speech, claiming the incident was just a personal mistake by Walsh, had now become a joke as Jordan's video spread throughout the city. The phone in his office rang constantly from reporters, from the mayor, from even volunteer lawyers demanding a review of the case. Hayes knew he couldn't keep avoiding it. The crowd outside wasn't just a group of protesters, it was the voice of all of New Orleans, demanding the truth that had been buried for so long. Finally, the pressure became an unstoppable wave. A lawyer from the local human rights organization, contacted by the media after Elena's article, appeared with a subpoena to review the security footage from a bar near the jewelry store. Footage Walsh had deliberately ignored. The video was made public later that afternoon, shown on a large screen set up by the protesters in front of the station. It showed Jamal walking dozens of meters away from the scene, nowhere near the store when the robbery occurred, while a shadowy figure wearing a gray jacket, the person Jordan had photographed, rushed out from the store with a handful of jewelry. The crowd roared, applause erupting like thunder, and Jordan felt his throat tighten as he watched the station's door swing open. Jamal stepped out, his legs shaking but his face lighting up when he saw Jordan in the sea of people. "Jordan!" he yelled, running into his arms, tears streaming uncontrollably. But the victory didn't blind Jordan. As he hugged Jamal tightly, he looked over his shoulder and saw Hayes standing at a distance, his eyes now hollow like a defeated man forced to accept failure. Walsh didn't appear. Maybe he was held back for investigation, or perhaps simply hiding from the eyes of those he once looked down upon. The crowd kept chanting, but Jordan knew this wasn't the end. The streets had spoken, forcing the system to bow, but that shadow still remained, silent and patient, waiting for another opportunity to return. He squeezed Jamal's hand, whispering in his ear, "You're safe now, but I won't let this happen again to anyone." The cheers of the crowd echoed, but in Jordan's heart, another fire had ignited, the fire of a vow left unspoken. As dusk descended over New Orleans like a vibrant red velvet curtain, it bathed the small houses in the poor neighborhood with warm hues, contrasting sharply with the chill of the past few days. Jordan Bell stood on the small porch of his home, his hands tightly clasped, his distant gaze sweeping across the familiar street where old bicycles slowly rolled by and the sound of children's laughter echoed through the still air. Jamal Carter, his cousin who had just escaped the iron grip of the system, sat leaning against the weathered wooden railing beside him, his eyes still tinged with confusion but now regaining the bright spark of his 17 years. His favorite green hoodie, now clean with no mud or torn shoulders, was a small symbol of the freedom he had just reclaimed. The soft sound of footsteps came from inside the house, and Mrs. Lorraine Bell stepped out, holding a wooden tray with 2 glasses of cold lemonade. Her face, though still marked by the tension of the last few hours, had softened somewhat. "Drink up, both of you," she said, her voice hoarse but warm as she set the tray down on the small table by the porch. She sat in the old armchair, her eyes quietly observing the 2 cousins, as if wanting to make sure that all of this was not just a fragile dream. Jordan took a sip of the lemonade, the sweet and sour taste flooding his throat, but it couldn't erase the bitter aftertaste of the past days. The protest in front of the police station, the shouts of the crowd, and the moment Jamal stepped out from behind the iron door, all of it was still vivid in his mind, like the frames he had captured with his Nikon, now lying silently in the bag on the chair. He turned to Jamal, who was absent-mindedly fiddling with the zipper of his jacket, a faint smile on his lips, a smile still a little shy but sincere. "You okay?" Jordan asked, his voice softer, not out of doubt, but because he wanted to hear Jamal speak it himself. Jamal nodded, his fingers stopping on the zipper, his eyes lifting to meet his cousin's. "I'm okay, bro. But those days, I thought I wouldn't make it out. They didn't listen to me, didn't believe me. Only you and Elena didn't give up." Jamal's words were soft but heavy, like a stone dropping into a still pond, sending ripples through Jordan's heart. He set the glass down, his hand resting on the railing, his gaze sweeping across the now peaceful street. "It wasn't just me and Elena," he replied. "The whole city spoke up for you. Those people out there, they know what happened, and they didn't let it go." Mrs. Lorraine sighed softly, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze drifting off as if recalling old memories. "You did something great, Jordan," she said, her voice slow but firm, like an undeniable affirmation. "You gave that boy a chance that not everyone gets. But how many other kids out there don't have someone taking pictures for them, writing stories for them? Today you won, but what about tomorrow?" Her words were sharp, not to hurt, but to awaken. A question without an answer that Jordan knew he couldn't avoid. He fell silent for a moment, letting his mother's words sink deep into the corners of his soul. Today, Jamal had been set free, but the price of that victory had been so many days lived in fear, so many tears from family, and how many shouts from the crowd were enough to shake the system. He remembered the face of Marvin Hayes on television, the confusion in his eyes when the crowd roared, and the way Derek Walsh disappeared from sight like a ghost fleeing from the light. But he also knew they were not all there was. They were just puppets in a bigger play, where the invisible people like Jamal, like the black teens being searched on Decatur Street, were already presumed guilty before they even spoke. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Elena Morales stepped in, her arms holding a stack of printed photos. The pictures Jordan had taken during the protest, now printed as living postcards of an unforgettable day. She placed them on the table, her brown eyes shining with unwavering determination. "This is what you've accomplished," she said, her voice gentle but strong, like an underground river. "These photos are not just images. They're the voices of those no one sees. I've sent them to a human rights organization in Baton Rouge. They want to meet with you. They want to use them to expand the story." Jordan looked down at the stack of photos, faces of the protesters, the signs reading, "The lights don't see us," and Jamal's expression when he walked out of the station. All like a wordless book, telling the story he had lived through. "I won't stop, Mom," Jordan said, turning to Mrs. Lorraine, his voice low but burning like a fire that couldn't be put out. "This camera is my weapon. It saved Jamal, and it will save others. I'll shoot, I'll record, I'll make the world see what they've been trying to hide." Elena smiled, placing her hand on his shoulder, her warmth like a wordless affirmation. "And the pen is mine," she added. "We're a team, Jordan. Today is just the first step." As the darkness slowly covered the street, Jordan stood up and walked out onto the porch, the camera slung over his shoulder like an inseparable part of him. He walked to the corner of the street where black children were playing under the flickering streetlights, their laughter rising like an optimistic melody in the midst of dark days. He raised his camera, the lens capturing each moment. A boy hopping on one foot, a girl drawing with chalk on the sidewalk, the light from the street lamp casting their faces in a promise of a future. "The lights may not see us," he whispered, his voice blending with the night wind, "but I'll make sure the whole world sees." He pressed the shutter button, the flash lighting up the faces of the invisible people the system tried to forget. The sound of Jamal's footsteps rang out behind him, and he stood beside him, his eyes shining as he looked at the children. "Did you do this for me?" he asked, his voice small but full of emotion. Jordan shook his head, placing his hand on Jamal's shoulder. "Not just for you, for all of them, for the ones who don't have anyone to take pictures for them, who don't have anyone to speak up." The sunset faded, giving way to darkness, but in Jordan's heart, a new light had flared up, the light of the invisible people, and he would be the one to keep it burning forever. As night fully descended, New Orleans transformed into a surreal picture of lights and shadows, where the winds from the Mississippi River carried the salty breath of the sea, sweeping through narrow streets and weathered rooftops. Jordan Bell stood silently on the porch of his home, his hands tightly intertwined, his gaze no longer directed at the children playing under the streetlights, but quietly drifting far beyond, past the low houses, past the vibrant yet scarred city, reaching for an invisible horizon, where larger questions about justice, humanity, and himself awaited. Jamal had returned to his room, the sound of his laughter with Mrs. Lorraine echoing from the small kitchen, a sound as pure as a wind chime amidst the storms of the past. Elena Morales sat beside him on the old wooden chair, her hands quietly flipping through the protest photos he had taken, each frame a vivid engraving of a story not only belonging to them, but to an entire forgotten community. The story of Jamal, from the moment he was dragged into the police car with his bruised face to the instant he walked out of the station to the cheers of the crowd, was not just a random series of events happening on one festival night in New Orleans. It was a mirror, quietly but sharply reflecting the dark corners of a society where the brilliant lights only shine on a few, leaving others in the invisible shadows. Jordan understood that Jamal's victory was not a complete ending, but a small chapter in a book that was far from finished. He had used his camera, Elena had used her pen, and the crowd had used their voices to pull him from the darkness. But that darkness didn't disappear. It merely receded, patiently and coldly like a predator waiting for the next opportunity. The meaning of this story lies not in the freedom Jamal gained, but in how it forced people to face a harsh truth. Justice is not a gift that falls naturally from the sky, but something that must be fought for, dug out from the ashes of prejudice and indifference. Jordan recalled each moment, from Derek Walsh's cold stare when he claimed he didn't need evidence to arrest Jamal, to the panic in Marvin Hayes' eyes when the crowd roared outside the police station. These people were not the only enemies. They were just cogs in a massive machine. a system built on unfair foundations, where skin color, background, and poverty could make someone a criminal before they even had a chance to prove their innocence. Jamal's story was a warning, not just for New Orleans, but for anywhere that still had lights that only illuminated one side. The first lesson Jordan learned from this journey was the power of truth. Not the truth painted with flowery words, but the raw truth, captured through lenses and pens, proven with irrefutable evidence. The photo of the man in a gray jacket running from the jewelry store, the video of Walsh turning his back on the security camera, the testimony of the Old Street vendor. All these were small pieces, but when placed together, they formed a larger picture powerful enough to shake an entire system. He understood that this truth didn't just appear on its own. It demanded patience, courage, and sacrifice. The sleepless nights analyzing photos, the hours spent under the scorching sun setting up the camera, and the moments facing the hostile gazes of the police. These were all the prices he had to pay for the light to reach Jamal. But the deeper lesson Jordan realized was the power of community, a power not found in weapons or authority, but in the unity of small people against a massive machine. When he stood on the wooden crate in front of the crowd, holding up Jamal's photo, he wasn't just speaking for him. He was speaking for hundreds of others, the mothers who lost their children, the children falsely arrested, the street vendors pushed aside. The chant, "Free Jamal," wasn't just a slogan. It was the roar of a city that had suffered too long, a declaration that they would no longer let the festival lights obscure the truth. Jordan realized that he couldn't do this alone. Without Elena's article, without the old vendor's truthful testimony, without the crowd raising their clenched fists, Jamal would likely still be locked in the dark. Elena gently placed the stack of photos on the table, turning to look at Jordan, her eyes gleaming with a wordless understanding. "What do you think?" she asked, her voice gentle, but carrying the weight only those who have walked with him through the line between despair and hope could possess. Jordan tilted his head, taking a deep breath of the night air, letting the scent of dry grass from the nearby street fill his lungs. "I think this isn't the end," he replied, his voice low but firm like an unbreakable vow. "We've given Jamal a chance, but how many others out there? How many children arrested just for walking on the wrong street at the wrong time? How many families torn apart because no one will see them?" He paused, his gaze drifting over the photos on the table, the faces of the crowd, the protest signs, the fiery eyes. "We have to continue, not to prove anything, but to make sure no one is invisible again." Mrs. Lorraine came out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her worn apron, her gaze resting on Jordan with a quiet pride. "You're more like your father than you think," she said, her voice hoarse but warm like an old song. "He always said that justice is not something people give you, it's something you demand. Today, you've demanded it for Jamal, but what will you do for tomorrow?" Jordan smiled a rare but sincere smile, then stood up, walked over to the camera lying still on the chair. He picked it up, feeling its familiar weight in his hands, and turned to look at his mother, at Elena, at Jamal standing in the doorway with bright eyes. "I'll keep shooting," he said, his voice rising like an unbreakable promise. "I'll go to the streets the lights don't reach. I'll record the stories no one wants to hear. I'll make sure the invisible people are seen. And if the system won't change, I'll make it change, one picture, one story, one day at a time." Elena stood up, placing her hand on his shoulder, her gaze holding a silent promise. Jamal stepped forward, hands in his jacket pockets, his voice small but sure. "I'll help you. I want to tell my story, so no one else has to go through that again." The night deepened, but on that small porch, a new light had flared. Not the light of street lamps or festivals, but the light of will, of truth, and of people who refused to be forgotten. Jamal's story was not just a victory. It was a call, a lesson that justice doesn't come from being granted, but from relentless struggle. And Jordan, with his camera in hand, knew that he would never stop. Not today, not tomorrow, but forever, until every light shines justice for all.